CEO at GitLab. Today we're going to talk about pricing for open source. I'm joined by Paul from Supabase. Paul, you want to introduce yourself and the company real quick?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sid. My name is Paul. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Supabase. And Supabase is an open source Firebase alternative. We're building the features of Firebase, but we use open source products. So we try to use existing open source products wherever possible, actually. And if they don't exist or we don't think they're enterprise ready, then we'll develop and open source them ourselves.
Awesome. Cool. I'm a big Postgres fan, so cool to see this. You prepped some questions, maybe launch off. You want to ask the first question?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I prepped a lot of questions on pricing, as most people who have worked in open source know monetization is quite tough. So I'd love to maybe start with a brief history of GitLab's pricing, some of the things that you tried, some of the things that worked and didn't work.
Yeah. First thing we tried was donations. Dimitri called it ice cream money because it netted him $7 each month. And that was enough to buy ice cream for him and his partner. We managed to increase it to $1,000, which is pretty awesome. I think if you're really popular, you can get to paying for one or two people. It's not enough to kind of take on a complete company or something like that. So we try support. I see a lot of open source companies doing that. And we saw completely rational behaviors on part of our customers, as in when they start with GitLab, they would use support. When they needed help, they would get support. But after a year, they stopped the support contract because they weren't using it anymore. And there's kind of a perverse incentive where every time someone has a question, you're like, hey, should I update the docs or should I just have everyone run into this and come ask us for support? And so it's not the right incentive and it's not high enough margin. We tried paid development where we said, look, if you want extra features in GitLab, you'll pay for it. But there was a bit of a bystander effect. When multiple people asked for the same feature, we informed them like, hey, you only have to pay half. And instead of being very excited that they only had to pay half, they both like stopped responding as in, oh, well, now the other company will pay for it. Also, it got categorized by the purchasing department as paid development. And they're like, paid development? We got people that do software development for us. We actually got a super good deal for a provider and they do all our software development. So there you are. Yeah. You were finally going to make some money, and instead you got a bunch of Java programmers trying to work on a Ruby code base, and you're not getting paid for your effort, and actually it would have been less time to just do it yourself in the first place. So it didn't work at all. So we settled on asking money for proprietary features. It's a great model. It works. Just there's a lot to how that works, but it was superior to what we tried before.
Oh, yeah, very nice. Funnily enough, we've been only monetizing through donations so far because we're in alpha. We didn't feel it was good enough to monetize and start charging our customers. So we just put a sponsors link up. And so our main sponsor is a VC actually, who obviously want the publicity. But yeah, we feel the pain of gathering up sponsorship. Yeah, so now you've settled on this sort of buyer-based pricing model. I'd love to, hear some of the pros and cons, or more how you came about it and how you think about maybe setting up the buckets of different pricing, or you can actually explain it, what it is and how it works first, and maybe then some strategies of how you came up with it.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we're going to charge for some features. How do you bucket the features across your free features or open source features and then the paid ones? Why do people pay more? And one thing we looked at, like, we bet that bigger companies pay more. So we're going to price like that. But then some smaller companies came and said, look, we need the features that you have in the bigger company subscription. However, we're not a big company. And you say that you only charge a lot to big companies. So you've bucketed the features wrong. I'm like, it kind of makes sense. We understand you need those advanced features. And yes, we say we only charge big companies. So that was a big dilemma. And actually, since GitLab is a pretty comprehensive solution, some of smaller companies tended to be on the forefront of adoption and needed even like more features than some of the bigger companies that weren't this far along. So that didn't work. Then we also tried like, well, it's about the sophistication. And we learned like, oh, these small companies are very far along in the process. So the more advanced you are DevOps wise, the more you're going to pay. That didn't quite work because there were some companies that had to undergo like digital transformation. They were super excited about GitLab. It would revolutionize their business. And then we would be steering them to our lowest tier. Because like just getting started with DevOps, great, take our lowest tier. Well, these were the customers that the willingness to pay was extremely high. So it didn't match kind of the willingness to pay. So that didn't work out. And then we settled on like, hey, it really depends on who reaches out to us. If we're talking with executives, they're fine with paying more per user. Like they see the strategic value. If we're talking with a manager who has to explain it to the engineering director, like they have a hard time getting approval. So basically like not just willingness to buy, but ability to buy it almost. So, and they have very different demands. Like the manager just wants some approvals, a director maybe wants stability, the executive wants like enterprise-wide planning and security initiatives. So we're like, hey, this is it. Depends on who the buyer is. Who are we talking with? We can kind of guess which features they like. We can price them accordingly.
Yeah, that's quite interesting as well, because they probably come in on different channels, I imagine. So developers come in sort of bottom up, see your website and will buy or start using directly from the website. Whereas you might have the, other managers and above, are they actually coming in and looking at the website, or how do they actually land into GitLab?
Yeah, there's a bit of a distinction, but it's not as clear as you'd think. We have people buying our top tier just off the website, people we never spoke to. And we have some people with a lot of like sales interaction and hand holding and a lot of procurement processes who end up buying our lowest tier. So kind of the channel has not been a very good predictor.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so probably one of the most complex parts, I guess, of coming up with the buckets. I would think of open source kind of like two different things. You've either got very heavy infrastructure type products, maybe your Hadoop, and you literally need to re-engineer everything, and then all the way up to a product, maybe even it's on the spectrum, a product where you can just install maybe quite simply just a single installation. You can get started yourself. You wouldn't need too much engineering around it. I actually think there are elements of GitLab, for example, the runners, the continuous integration runners, which are more like infrastructure. You're paying for a lot of heavy infrastructure to go on there. How do you think about pricing between the heavy infrastructure stuff and the more producty, just features?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't have an opinion about that. However, I do have an opinion on what you say. Like there's a clear difference between the two. And I've articulated that in the context of how likely are you to experience fork and commoditize. Basically, AWS taking your open source code base and adding some of your paid features to it. And we make the distinction between application software, so that'd be things like GitLab, and infrastructure software, things like MongoDB. And we think, if you look at the interface, application software has a user interface, the infrastructure software has an API. And in the context of forking and commoditization, like an interface is much harder to replicate. You think of it in the form of compute usage. Application software drives less compute although we have CI and things like that. But like a MongoDB is just infrastructure drives the compute. It's much closer to the metal. And hyperclouds want to drive compute. So they're more likely to fork and commoditize infrastructure. Deployment, GitLab.com, Salesforce, they're multi-tenant. Infrastructure software is always single tenant, always employed in a VPC with your cluster. So that fits more with the hyperclouds, things like RDS, like one deployment per customer. Feature richness, application software has more features, harder to replicate. And also ecosystem activity. MongoDB CEO, for example, said, look, open source is great for marketing, but we have very few contributions to the engine. It's just very hard for people to contribute there. So I see that distinction. I don't have an opinion on how it relates to pricing. I think on average, the infrastructure people end up selling to the IT department. And the IT department historically has a bigger budget. The DevOps people don't have the budget. The IT people control the budget. They have no problem paying for big databases. So it's great people to sell to. You see that, for example, on the success of companies like HashiCorp with their Vault product. They sell to IT departments, and I bet they have a much higher ASP, average sales price, than GitLab.
I guess though, I mean, that's very particular to the cloud vendors. I just wonder, so let's take a pure application. I have seen, for example, Sentry, a great product.
Yeah,
awesome. I've seen people literally take everything that they did, even the website included, and then just swap the logo for something new. So in that case, it's easy, not so much for a cloud provider. Maybe they would be scared of the legalities of doing such a thing, but it's perfectly fine for an application to be, especially if it's MIT or Apache 2, to be sort of just cloned and then spun up, and you create, say, a hosted provider around it and start charging people around that. So I guess in that case, applications might be quite simple to copy, but also start making money off an application versus infrastructure. An individual it's very hard for an individual to come in and clone a full infrastructure project. It can only really be done by the cloud providers, which was what we saw with sort of Redis, Elastic.
I think there's something else at play here too, namely there were no proprietary features in Sentry. So it wasn't fork and commoditize. It wasn't even fork. It was just, you could just take the code base. There were no proprietary features to commoditize. I think that's a big difference. So I'm working on the assumptions that that's open core, that there's some open source and some proprietary features, and it applies to that.
Yes. So I saw on your website that open source is not equal to open source business or something similar to this.
Yeah,
right?
So GitLab has an open source, contains open source code, but we consider ourselves an open core company. Because if we call ourselves open source, the people in Hacker News complain that we ship proprietary code, and they're totally right.
Yeah. And that's critical to building a business.
I think so. I think in order to have a fast growing startup, you need at least 60% margins. And I don't think you'll get there with support. Now there's counter examples, famously Red Hat, but it's been hard for people to replicate that. And I think Cloudera is now getting there, but it's been a struggle to get there.
Yeah. I tend to agree. I mean, the earlier stages of course of the business are the most critical as well. So you need every advantage that you can take to grow the business. So open core seems to be the winning strategy at this stage. So yeah, I thought as well, maybe we could talk more as well on not just the pricing, but also the sales and how it works. Maybe so I watched a few talks on sales, and they'll talk largely around maybe pairing up a solution architect with your sales team if it's required. Maybe more application might require maybe one solution architect to say 10 salespeople. And whereas when you get down to infrastructure, you need sort of more a one-to-one mapping. A solution architect is on every single
we have,
meeting.
I think, three salespeople to one solution architect.
Okay. And then how do you do sales? Is it a lot of outbound, or do you get enough inbound from your website, and it's largely just sort of farmers?
It's a combination. In the beginning, it was more inbound, and as you grow bigger, the inbound is not enough, so you start having more outbound to augment that. And that's now, I think, outbound, so people calling, but also like advertising, partnerships, SEO, content, all these things to drive traffic and marketing leads.
Yeah, sure. For the outbound of your sales team, was there a change in the sales team, or was there a shift from they had to change their strategy from, well, I've heard the term farmers to hunters?
I think over time it evolved. So you start off with not having any activities, just a contact form on the website, and that's enough. And over time, you do more and more, and you become more and more proactive.
Yeah. And then do they feed into the salespeople? Do they feed into the pricing, and do they give good discussions on what to build, new features that are being requested?
Yeah, for sure. Both on a detailed level, where they place all our features are open. There are issues on our issue tracker, and they place Salesforce links with a link to the customer in that, so we can see like who's interested in the feature without disclosing the customer name. Mm-hmm. And then on a higher level, there's a list that sales keeps, like these are the top 10 things we need, and they discuss that with product, or we need, that our customers need.
Okay. That's very good. So I guess then on the buyer-based pricing, is there sort of a next iteration? Are there still some things which are not going well that need to be improved? For a new startup who's thinking about pricing, and they're going to say, use this strategy. What should they be thinking about, and what improvements could they make on your model?
Yeah, I think what we have done is we priced very low. We started with $2 per user per month, and we doubled that to $4. But that leaves very little margin after all of our costs. So if I had to do it again, I wouldn't have introduced that such low pricing.
Okay, that's nice. And then in terms of the number of buckets, and would it grow? Is it good to start with? I think you've got 4 different sort of buyer profiles. How did you come up with that, and how would you recommend a startup comes up with that?
Yeah, well, we had so don't do what I did. I introduced a $2 thing, and then everyone was like, it's way too low, and we couldn't make it business. We doubled it, and everyone was like, okay, that's okay, but never do that again. And then I pitched to VC, and I said, look, we're going to make $1,000 per user per year. And that was 25 times what I was charging at the time. So I pitched them. No one in the room believed me. But I still thought, okay, no one told me, luckily. That's sometimes great if people don't tell you. So I thought, okay, I got to get to the $1,000, 25x. That's pretty steep. Let's do it in 2 steps of 5x, kind of neatly divides down. So that's what we did. We introduced a higher tier at 5 times as much, and then a higher tier 5 times as much. And we're now charging $1,100. And some people in the room came back like, Sid, you pitched that. I never thought people would pay that much. So, but luckily, it's not the same product that I pitched at the time. That was just version control. We now do the complete DevOps lifecycle. But I think the common mistake that founders make is pricing too low. I've heard that from a ton of founders. I've never heard pricing too high. People will just leave, and you can lower your prices. So it's much easier to resolve.
I guess then throw yourself back to the start, 5 years, you didn't have that feature set. and maybe you couldn't have got the $99 a month type profile. How do you get there? Is it a matter of just rolling out new pricing as you roll out new features?
For sure. There's some effect that you add more value. What we've done when we introduced our top tier, we waited until first we had the lowest tier. Then when half of our revenue had transferred to the middle tier, we introduced the top tier. What we did in the beginning was, hey, new tier, there's no features basically in it because we have to add that every month and it's just new. So you're going to get a great discount. You're going to get it for almost the same price as the middle tier. And then after that action ended, a quarter long or half a year long, we said, okay, we're just going to do big discounts in case it makes sense. And it's tricky because you have to treat people equally, and so you got to. I think we managed that well. But you can solve some of it with discounting, and then over time that discounting is reduced as the value accumulates in that tier.
Okay, got it. And then do you ever shift around once you've got the bucket set up, do you move around items within the buckets and features from one bucket to another?
So far, like moving features up is obviously, it's very concerning for customers. So we try to not do that. We do regularly move features down. We kind of err on the side of, okay, rather have it in too high of a bucket because we can always move it down. If we move it up, it's very upsetting to people. And for the open source tier, we never move something out of open source. Like if it's open source, we'll never make it closed source afterwards.
Yeah, got it. I think I chatted to the founders of Calm, the API gateway. They said that, they use a very similar strategy. So they start with sort of, or most of the time it'll be, say, an enterprise plugin, which then might become popular enough, and then they'll put it into open source. So I think starting restrictive and making it open is always seems to be the way to go.
Yep. I was saying that Cloudera had low gross margins, but I'm looking at their quarterly filing, and their gross margin is over 75%. So that's no longer true. So good for them.
Yeah, okay. That's very nice. Okay, that's great. I mean, that's, really everything that I wanted to know about pricing, how you tackle it, and it's pretty useful stuff. Oh,
I remember Cloudera was the one that did do proprietary features. So maybe it makes my point. They acquired one of their competitors that promised all code open source. That was hard to make money on. So that's maybe
okay.
I think what the lesson is there, what some companies do is they try to price for the convenient distribution. So like all of our code is open source. However, if you want a binary and if you want easy updates, then you have to pay us.
Yeah.
I think that's tricky. I think that opens the door to someone else just saying, okay, well, I'll compile open source and send updates. And I think also you're missing a big benefit because ease of installation is just very important. So by not offering that binary, like you kind of miss out on the marketing aspect of open source.
Yeah, okay. And I guess though for that's specific to application type products where it's easy to install, maybe infrastructure a little bit.
I think infrastructure too, like wants to compile from source, rather add like a deb server.
Sure. A single installation. We've got a funny situation where so Supabase is actually made up of 5 different open source tools now. We're Postgres on the bottom, and then we use Calm for our API gateway. We use Postgres, which is a tool that sits on top of Postgres. We actually hired the maintainer of that. We use GoTrue, Netlify's GoTrue. We use a real-time server that we produce ourselves, an Elixir server. The only problem is that each one of them sort of scales independently. Each one can be installed on its own, but Supabase as a package is actually all of these things, and we try to we're just taking existing communities, trying to support them. So we're in this situation where it's not so easy to install a single item. You can't just run Supabase on a server. Well, you can, and we're working towards that, but you probably don't get the benefits of everything scaling independently.
So is it easy to install Supabase on a single server?
It's easy to install each individual component, and we make them even easier. So for example, Postgres wasn't on the DigitalOcean marketplace, and we were the first to actually put it onto the marketplace.
I'd suggest that you have a look at our Omnibus project. It's Chef-based, and it's been a great way to kind of install kind of multiple software packages that together form one service. And I think it's a big part of the distribution that GitLab has gotten and the traction that we have gotten, where it's very simple to just install it.
And so that's a single server installation, is it?
Yeah, or multi-server, but also single server, yes. And I think the majority of installations start out as a single server.
Oh, very nice. Okay.
Cool.
And then
thanks for the call.
Thanks, Sid. Appreciate it.
You too.
Nice to see you.